Welcome to WNPR's new podcast titled Tourism in Yellowstone, where we discuss positive and negative impacts associated with tourism in Yellowstone. Today with me I have Shiloh Windsor and Zane Buchanan, and we're going to discuss some of the positive and negative impacts of tourism in Yellowstone and some ways that we can mitigate those. For a little bit of background on the park, Yellowstone is the nation's first national park designated by President Ulysses S. Grant on March 1st of 1872. The park was designated for the enjoyment of the people. There were no national parks in the U.S. at the time. There was no place for everybody just to recreate almost legally at that time, I guess. So the park was designated for just the enjoyment of the people and for to preserve the scenic vistas. Shiloh, do you want to tell me about some of the negative impacts of tourism?
So in the Yellowstone National Park, our overarching problem is overcrowding. The majority of the visitors are not from the area or even the country, so that brings a lack of knowledge about the destination. A big problem that the park is having currently is the people interacting with wildlife. As you've seen on YouTube and heard stories, people getting too close to bison, getting too close to elk, and messing with things that they shouldn't be messing with. That has become a huge problem. Another big issue that Yellowstone is facing is the pollution, summertime and wintertime. There's a lot of litter going on, and during the wintertime, the pollution from the snowmobiles and recreation in those categories are skyrocketing. Basically, due to Yellowstone's incredible natural resources, people are pretty much loving the park to death, but there are solutions to these problems.
And before we let Zane get into some of the solutions, that lack of knowledge from the destination is it's called destination stewardship, and a lot of these visitors are just lacking that. And destination stewardship involves everything from respecting the natural environment to the cultural environment. So a lot of these visitors don't necessarily even know that they're doing wrong when they're coming too close to the bison or elk or even bears sometimes. But that's one of the main solutions that I think we're going to touch on today is education. And then with the pollution in Yellowstone, a lot of it in the wintertime anyway isn't too obvious until the snow runoff occurs, and then that affects a lot of the trees and a lot of the just vegetation that depend on the runoff because they're kind of tainted with all the exhaust and oil, anything from the snowmobiles or even the snow coaches. But yeah, Zane, you want to get into some of the solutions?
All right. So first, I'm going to talk about the overcrowding because that tends to lead to the other things. And if we solve the overcrowding, that'll start to solve a lot of the other issues. A couple of solutions that we came up with personally, just in this group and in this podcast, is the Grand Canyon runs a permit system. So you have to apply into a lottery, and if you draw out of the lottery, you get a permit to visit the park and descend the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River, which has really limited the economic impacts of overcrowding and the ecological impacts, which is a little bit more important. It's kept the actual canyon itself a lot cleaner, a lot healthier, and a lot more ecologically diverse than it would be if it was just an open access type of thing. So we think that if you were to have a permit system where you only allow 200,000 people to visit in a given season, that would limit a lot of the impacts, and it would allow the park to perform all of its biological studies and all the other things that the national park system does on top of the tourism. And you could test this in the off season, say like in the winter months when it's not as busy, and then if it starts to work out in the off season, you could roll over into the summer months when hundreds of thousands of people want to come visit, and it would be an easy transition. And then for the pollution, the national park system has already kind of started limiting the number of snowmobiles and other vehicles that can enter Yellowstone. They're required to have an up-to-date emission standards, and they have to modify, and the park modifies its entrances so that only certain vehicles can get through, which is a pretty efficient solution because if you can't fit your big truck through it, you can't take your big truck into the park. And then another big one that we think would be good is some sort of education. LNT, Leave No Trace, is a really good one. It's a good basis for environmental stewardship, and destination stewardship. So we think that if you were entering the park, especially if you're a tourist who's not from that area and isn't familiar with how to keep somewhere clean, how to respect somewhere like a national park, having to go through a basic leave no trace orientation where you learn the 10 principles and have to and can kind of prove that you understand the impacts of not following those principles, we think it would be beneficial in the long run. And we don't know if you would have to get a sticker or some sort of sign that you hang on your campsite that shows that you went to that orientation. If you don't have that, you have to go and do it before you can remain in the park. Those are just some of the solutions that we kind of came up with that we think would limit the crowding, limit the messing with the animals, and limit the pollution to some extent.
Right. So that the whole lottery and permitting idea would some of the 2018 statistics were 4.1 million visitors to the park in that year alone, and that did bring in almost 700 million, almost 650 million rather, to the local economy, and provided roughly 7,000 jobs. While that boost of money into the local economy and jobs are good, they won't be affected too much by a lottery system. There would still be millions of people permitted to visit the park per year. It would just limit ecological impacts, like Zane was saying, in kind of concentrated areas like along the river or in a lot of the recreational areas, particularly in the winter with the over snow vehicles, and then in the summer just on the trails, kind of making sure that nobody's leaving the pre-made trails. So I think that's all our solutions. Again, this is WNPR's new podcast titled Tourism in Yellowstone, where we discuss the positive and negative impacts and how to mitigate those. This is Shiloh. That's Zane. I'm Alex. Thanks for watching.